Okay, so for today we're going to be going over 6.0 to 6.03. And so I decided, normally I kind of skip the opening page, but I really liked the quotes for this, so I thought I would start here. And so the first one is Martin Luther King Jr. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. We are a nation of many nationalities, many races, many religions, bound together by a single unity, the unity of freedom and equality. Whoever seeks to set one nationality against another seeks to degrade all nationalities. And then finally, down here, either America will destroy ignorance or ignorance will destroy the United States. And I just think that those are still really prevalent quotes, and they fit well with today's climate, as well as you can always find ways to make these fit no matter where you are or what your situation is. And so the question was basically, slavery was already a big issue during colonial times. It posed economic and philosophical challenges. And so the question that we were just talking about on Monday was, how can a nation where all men are created equal exist when there is slavery within that nation? And then the question that was being asked is, where are issues of equality being seen in today's world? Whether it's, economic, the pay of women is not equal or things like that. There are still ways where things are not all created equal. And so that would have been a good discussion to have had. The person we're going to talk about is Frederick Douglass. He was born a slave, escaped to freedom as a young man, and became one of the leading abolitionists and orators of his age. And so we're going to look at an excerpt of his autobiography and look at the themes of his work, as well as his language and its impact, because his language is very... He did it for a very particular reason. He thought carefully about how he was going to tackle the very touchy subject of slavery. And so he was really particular about his writing, and his language is powerful. The question was, an abolitionist a person who was against slavery and wanted freedom for the slaves? What is an orator? It's a person that would go around and speak. And so they would give lectures at colleges. His staunch anti-slavery views should not shock you, but the language he uses to explain why and how slavery damages the oppressed as well as the oppressor might surprise you. So he also looks at how slavery was bad for the owners. And now the question over here is, who is his audience? He wrote not only to people who shared his views, so he didn't write just to abolitionists, individuals. He also wrote to people who didn't have a strong opinion about slavery, who didn't really care one way or the other. He wanted to persuade those people to care and to not let slavery continue. If such people would not object to the negative impact of slavery on African Americans, the reasoning behind the argument went, perhaps they would object to the negative impact of slavery on white people. So if they didn't care about black people, maybe they would care about the effect it had on white people, was his thought process. Okay, so the first thing he did is he did talk about the impact on slaves. He was born into slavery in 1818, lived the first 20 years of his life as a slave. His autobiography talks about how he was robbed of his personal freedom, his dignity, and his humanity. He talks about being physically and mentally abused, as well as the anguish of those who were also slaves. It's an eyewitness account because it was his experience, and it leaves no doubt about the horrors and how terrible slavery was. The narrator doesn't depict slaves as the only victim, though. Who are the other victims? He shows that the slave owners were also victims of slavery. And so my new mistress proved to be all that she appeared when I first met her at the door, a woman of the kindest heart and finest feelings. She had never had a slave under her control previously to myself, and prior to her marriage she had been dependent upon her own industry for a living. So this is a quote he had about his owner, his new mistress, when he first met her. And so he describes her ownership of slaves as a fatal poison of irresponsible power. And so, you know, he just described her in a very positive way, right? He's talking about how she was kind and was very sweet. And then he talks about right here, once she became his owner, this kind heart had but a short time to remain such. The fatal poison of irresponsible power was already in her hands, and soon commenced its infernal work. That cheerful eye, under the influence of slavery, soon became red with rage. That voice, made all of sweet accord, changed to one of harsh and horrid discord, and that angelic face gave place to that of a demon. So how did she change? She went from angelic to demonic, from kind to angry. He originally was very positive about her. He loved that she was kind and had a sensitive nature. And then once she got her slave, I'm going to open up my notes so you can see them too. It talks about how she went from having this kind heart to changing dramatically. So, you know, she was originally able to empathize with Douglas because she was of her own industry, he said. So she worked hard for herself. Now she has a slave, and she became basically, you know, she became dependent on someone else doing all the work for herself. Okay. Fred, I'm going to make this bigger again for you so you can see this. So the individual and then the writer of Douglas. So his narrative shows that he was perceptive and smart. He understands his situation and what he's facing. He recognized, because he was very intelligent, that anything that his owner was withholding from him, that he should want it. He figured out ways to improve his condition and solve problems. So he figured out that like anything that the owner didn't want him to have was probably something he should want and learn. And then he writes about his thoughts and feelings in ways that demonstrate that he was very smart, had good insight. From reading the story of his youth, readers understand that he wants freedom, and then it goes into how he achieves it. So he's very explicit in the fact that he wanted freedom from a young age, and then talks about the avenues he took to gain his freedom. There is something, however, in the first part of his writing that is missing. And this is something that many readers would expect, you know, logically thinking about the fact that he's writing about the horrors and the lack of freedom and all of the just terrible stuff that happened to him as a child. You would expect to see emotion in his writing. However, he specifically left it out of his writing. He left emotion out. He didn't want emotion to take part. And the reason why was because, let me see if it's on the next page. Yes, okay. So in the early part of his narrative, he describes it in a very calm way, and he doesn't kind of, you know, go off the rail and just rant about how horrible his situation was. By not doing that, he is able to establish himself as reasonable and rational, and he's able to establish himself as someone that that their arguments are logical. You know, he's not being an emotional, illogical person. He's using logic and reason to discuss what was happening. So here's an example. I have had her rush at me with a face made up of fury and snatch from me a newspaper in a manner that fully revealed her apprehension. She was an apt woman, and a little experience soon demonstrated to her satisfaction that education and slavery were incompatible with each other. So in this little text here, he doesn't have emotion himself. She has all of the emotion. She's furious. She slaps him. She does all of these things. It's all on her. She's the emotional one and he's calm. So it's putting the emotion in the illogical association of you know, being too emotional to see reason. It gets put on to Sophia. It doesn't talk about how he felt, or that, you know, he hates her because she slapped him, or that she took the newspaper away. It doesn't say anything of that. He just talks about what she did and then kind of moves on. And so that establishes him as an unbiased, narrator. Sorry. Okay. He starts off no emotion to establish himself as a reliable narrator, and then he makes this decision as the author to remain detached as he relates to the early episode, and then as he grows older and learns to read, he comes across writings that deal with slavery, and these writings are what sparks the emotions, and the language he uses to describe himself captures that. So he's distanced himself from emotions in the beginning, and then as he educates himself in his story, then he starts to inject emotion into the writing. So he's showing that without education, he was emotionless. Once he becomes educated and is able to see the world and learn new things, that's when he starts to gain his emotions. So here is a little example. The more I read, the more I was led to abhor and detest my enslavers. I could regard them in no other light than a band of successful robbers who had left their homes and gone to Africa and stolen us from our homes, and in a strange land reduced us all to slavery. I loathed them as the meanest as well as the most wicked of men. So he went from, not having any emotion in the last one, she was slapping him, taking stuff away from him, to here he's using words like abhor, detest, robbers, meanest and most wicked of men, loathed them, right? Using very negatively connotated words. And he does this because he already established himself as that reliable narrator. And so now he's going to use that emotional language, and he's able to use the emotions without making the readers feel alienated, without making them kind of doubt whether or not he's credible, because he already established that he is a reliable narrator. You can trust him. He's not being overly emotional. Douglas explains the impact of what he read about slavery when he writes, so the reading of these documents enabled me to utter my thoughts and to meet the arguments brought forward to sustain slavery. It is not surprising then that Douglas, in turn, uses language to influence others on slavery. So he sees that while reading all these documents about why slavery was good and why it needs to keep going, he then uses his own language as a tool to win readers over to the side of no slavery. So it asks you to go back and look. So, like I said, abhor and detesting their enslavers, they were nothing more than robbers, right? So he's using his own language to put this vision of the enslavers as these robbers who stole people from their homes in the middle of the night and reduced them to nothing but more than a slave. And so he uses his language as a way, as that's his weapon against slavery. All right, that's it for today, and I will see you in class.